This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. I'm your host, Darren McKee, and with me, as usual, is Adam Gardner.
What's up, cuboids?
We have a great show for you today. Well, hopefully great. It's a bit different than usual. Adam and I are going to discuss the movie Oppenheimer. This won't be a thorough analysis of the facts versus the myths of the movie, although there's just a little bit of that. More just, we like this movie and we wanted to talk about it. So we're going to try out that for this particular show. So Oppenheimer is a movie that came out in 2023 about the life of J. Robert Oppenheimer, who is credited with being the father of the atomic bomb. By the way, before we go any further, there are going to be tons of spoilers in this show. So please, if you haven't seen the movie, go do that before you listen to this. It's a great, excellent movie. I highly recommend it, and I don't want to ruin any of it. So a brief overview of the movie, and then we'll just discuss whatever we happen to like. The movie covers different parts of Oppenheimer's life. It's not called the atomic bomb for a reason. It's called Oppenheimer. It is focused on his life. So you have Oppenheimer in the early 1920s up until about 1945. You have some of the time period in 1947, and then largely 1947 and afterwards, especially in the 50s for a particular hearing. So there's kind of 2 or 3 time periods, and in beautiful, wonderful Christopher Nolan fashion, he's moving back and forth across all of these different time periods. And so you can generally figure out which one you're in, because the character makeup or aging is done quite well. You know when Cillian Murphy, who's the main lead who plays Oppenheimer, looks older or younger. Also, Nolan uses black and white in different ways. So there's certain segments that involve Oppenheimer, which are typically in color, and there's other ones which involve this other guy named Strauss, who was a rival of sorts, and in the movie he's made to be the antagonist, and he is largely in black and white. The parts of the movie that surround Strauss is largely whether he is going to be appointed into the president's cabinet, and he's reflecting on certain things that happened in his past. And so it is very well done. It's fast-paced. It is largely talking. There is math. There is a bomb. But Christopher Nolan's done a great job. And I think largely, if you sort of try to analyze it a bit, there's fast edits. People speak intelligently and relatively quickly. Not necessarily in pace, but right after each other. So there's very little dead space when someone is talking versus someone else talking. And so it does add energy and so on.
For a pretty long movie.
For a 3-hour movie.
Yeah.
Right. And there's these moments where, like, if you ask yourself, how do you convey thinking in a visually interesting manner, right? And so there's pace or scribbling on a chalkboard furiously, but they've done some wonderful visual effects here where it's usually colors, which are pulses or ripples or vibration of string-like things and circles. And this is not only interesting visually on its own, but it does relate to different aspects of physics and phenomena at the atomic scale or even the quantum scale. So I just thought it was excellent, right? You have these different figures. You have the depth of Robert Oppenheimer, who believed he was doing mostly the right thing to develop this bomb to stop a war, and perhaps even that it would stop all war. And then realizing afterwards, after he built it, it's no longer within his control. And then feeling maybe the regret and the conflicted emotions that come with creating something that killed so many people. Well, that's me blathering a lot about at least a brief overview. Adam, what do you think?
Yeah, I thought it was fantastic. I don't usually like sort of based on a true story stuff. I always joke that like Matt Damon's always trying to make me think that the things in his movies are the most important thing. He's talking about soccer, or he's talking about making a car go fast, or he's talking about I don't know,
we built a house,
some amino acid. Oh, the zoo. And in this movie, the subject matter, it's not hard to convince me, at least, that this was like really important, because I think the fate of the world literally depended on the events of what was going on here. So it's kind of hard to oversell it. So it was a topic that is as interesting to me. Like in high school, I did like a project on the atomic bombs. So, you know, and a lot of these scientists are people who I've read about and stuff like that. And there's a whole subplot about security clearances, and like in my job, I have security clearance. So people talk about this stuff. I'm like, this is so weird. But like this aspect of this movie, which seems like it could be really dry, I find it really fascinating. So I just I was totally on board with everything about this movie. I really enjoyed it. Obviously, it was brilliantly made.
The soundtrack was excellent.
Yeah.
It does convey emotion in very important, interesting ways. It's excellent.
Yeah. The acting was really good. Some of the casting choices were very odd. It's some old teen star or a comedic actor or something and some of the scientists were young. We're used to just seeing old man scientists in movies, and some of them were younger and stuff like that. But everyone did a really amazing job in this movie. I was really impressed with that.
It's also interesting to see just how much everything's intentional with Christopher Nolan.
Yeah.
So I watched some analysis, and in a certain scene in the movie, Oppenheimer is trying to start sort of quantum physics research and students being interested in this subject in the States. And he starts with one student. And then there's a few more. And then as soon progresses to, there's many more students. Well, when he has the one student, there's one violin that plays. Oh. And when he has a couple students, now it's two violins. And when it's many students, now it's a symphony. Oh, cool. And only when I saw it again, after that was pointed out, oh, right, that's well done, right? And so there's so much that's very intentional, as I said, and I don't think any moment is wasted. So when you watch a bit of it again, the movie starts with a quote about Prometheus, and the book is called American Prometheus, upon which this was based. Adam had read it and I haven't. But they have a very quick, on the screen, it flashes fission when it has Oppenheimer and fusion when it has Strauss. And you're like, well, you didn't have to put that up there. Why? It just says one fission, two fusion. Now, why is that there? Well, okay, so fission is the first bomb, the atomic bomb that they develop. A fission bomb splits atoms apart. In this case, it was uranium, and a fusion puts them together. This would be the hydrogen one, even though they have different complexities. All that to say is, loosely, fission splitting apart, and fusion is coming together. And so I was trying to think, okay, is Robert's life something that's coming apart near the end in one way? And Strauss's things are coming together or comeuppance one way or another? And then you can think, well, that's also the order in which it happens in the movie. That's also the order in which the bombs are developed. And so, you can always just sort of overanalyze or overinterpret things. But because, again, it's Christopher Nolan and you realize the attention to detail is there, but that's there for a reason. He knew what he was doing, or at least had some idea whether I just interpreted correctly or not. Mm-hmm. So one of the interesting scenes was earlier in the movie, Oppenheimer's a younger man, and he's doing research in Europe, in the UK, and he is very annoyed with his tutor or his teacher at the moment, and so he poisons an apple. It's a scene in the movie where he grabs some cyanide and he injects it into this apple, and then he has a moment of crisis and he realizes that's a terrible idea, and he goes to stop it. And now when he goes to get the apple, he sees the apple still on the tutor's desk. And he goes to get the apple, and it's still there on the tutor's desk, thankfully, and the tutor's now talking to someone, and it's Niels Bohr, played by Kenneth Branagh. And this is a great exchange of dialogue, because it says Oppenheimer's not good with the beakers and the potions. You should go somewhere else. Where can you think? Ah, yes, Göttingen, and you should train under Max Born. It's so well executed and so on. Anyway, he's about to eat this apple, because now Niels Bohr has picked it up, and Cillian Murphy, Oppenheimer, quickly grabs it out of his hand, throws it in the garbage, and says wormhole. I'm like, is that a wormhole pun? Because Oppenheimer worked on black holes? I don't think so, but you never know. All that to say is, did he really try to poison his tutor? And the answer seems to be yes. Not in the more dramatic fashion with cyanide that would have killed the tutor, but in some way that would have caused some discomfort. And my understanding of it is that yes, he did do this. Yes, he was reprimanded, and perhaps he was saved from greater reprimand by his wealthy family stepping in and smoothing things out.
Yeah, and in the book, it's less precise on this. It's there's a possibility that he did attempt to poison him, but also maybe he imagined that he'd poisoned him, but he imagined it so strongly that he still admitted that he did it because he thought he did it. And then there's various people's opinion on whether that's true or not. So obviously it's hard to tell that in a movie, and it was confusing in the book. So there's a lot of things like that that are obviously way more expanded upon in the book, which is based on the books from 2005. I was surprised it was quite a bit older than the movie, but that is where the crux of the material comes from. So if you didn't really like the movie and you just want to I just need more of everything.
Yes,
it's worth checking out.
There are some absolutely wonderful exchanges of dialogue. Well, the whole book. That's why. The whole movie, I would say, is almost a wonderful exchange of dialogue. Every scene, I think, is great in certain ways. Now, that said, when Oppenheimer meets Heisenberg, I felt this was what we might say is expository, where there's a scene where characters are talking and they're just saying information that the audience needs to know, and it didn't quite flow as naturally. So most of the movie flowed quite well, but here he finally meets Heisenberg, again, this giant in the physics world, and Heisenberg's like, oh, I liked your paper on molecules. He's like, well, thanks. He's like, well, if you ever are inspired again, we should publish a paper. He's like, I have to go back to the States. It's like, well, you might say that, but that's a really weird thing to say in that way. Not like, that's a great offer. Thank you. I have to go back to the States. We could do it by correspondence. And he's like, oh, where do you have to go? He's like, I want to go to my ranch in Los Alamos. And he's like, New Mexico. You're like, okay, you had to work that in. And then his other friend, he's like, oh, not me though. I'm not a cowboy like him. You're like, oh, okay, what was this for? You just said he really likes the States and he wants to be out in the open space of New Mexico. Fine. It just seemed a little odd. And again, this wasn't bad. It's just that everything else was so smooth. He's at for example, Oppenheimer's at a meeting, a Communist Party meeting. He was not a member of the Communist Party, but he was intellectually curious and he attended these meetings, and that's what got him into trouble later with these security clearances, because as we know, the States was less concerned about communist stuff, but then they were very concerned about communist stuff. So someone's like, oh, well, maybe you don't really know. And he's like, well, I have read all 3 volumes of Marx's Das Kapital. Right? And then, so one guy's like, well, yeah, that makes you more well-read than most party members. And then this intriguing woman happens to sort of say like, well, no, it's about the ideas, right? And he's like, well, there are turgid thoughts in there, but there was something useful, about ownership being theft. And she's like, property. I say, property? And he goes like, well, I read it in the original German. And it was so funny. This person doesn't bat an eye. They're like, well, you've read it more in the original language, but I'm still right. My ideas are right. And then they have a sensual encounter where he impresses her by showing he knows Sanskrit. Whether they needed to work in the line, I am become death, while they're having sex. This seemed a bit odd. I thought it was an odd choice, I'll be honest. This is the famous line, I am become death, destroyer of worlds, that occurred to Oppenheimer when the bomb went off, the Trinity test. And this is earlier in the movie when he just happens to be with this woman in his room, and she, I don't know, positions herself so they're being sexually involved while she has him say this line. You're like, well, okay, I guess. It's an interesting choice. The sounds, by the way, in the movie, aside from just I said the soundtrack's great, there are often sounds that are part of major themes that occur much earlier in a movie for a split second here and there. And so there might be where people are stamping their feet in an important scene or part of the Trinity test or something else, and a little fraction of that sound occurs in other places. And that's a wonderful thing to sort of experience upon rewatching it. One of my other favorite lines was from Oppenheimer's physicist friend, who is trying to convey to him, like, stop with these dalliances with communism, because it's critical. You could be involved in this project to try to help win the war, but I can't involve you because you keep doing this. Yeah. And so he says to him, you're not just self-important, you're actually important. And it's such a great scene because within a moment, like a half second, Robert Oppenheimer, played by Cillian Murphy, sees the gravity and the importance of what his friend is trying to say and help him. And he quickly changes his mind, realizes what's going on, and thinks, okay, I have to distance myself from this. It'll be done. I'll cut those ties. I will help you. And that leads to him running the Manhattan Project.
The book gets into a lot more about Jean Tatlock and how troubled she was. The movie presents her death as a suicide. The book's narrative seems to suggest it was probably a suicide, but also kind of floats around the idea that, oh, well, some people think that maybe she was murdered or killed by the FBI or something like that, which to me seemed like, well, that's a huge thing to omit from the movie. But I feel like if you include that in your movie becomes about that, right? Like that's kind of like, it's making a strong statement about this idea. And I hadn't noticed it, but Darren, you mentioned there's a flash about it.
Yeah. So again, this is the skill of the filmmaking. So Robert, I keep calling him Robert Oppenheimer, is we're on a first name basis. Yes, exactly. Oppie. Yes, exactly. Oh, Bobby Oppie. He is informed that Jean has died. For some context, by the way. So that was a lover that he had, and then he married another woman, but he still sometimes sort of saw Jean, but not quite, not really. Depending on the interpretation of it, he's trying to bring her flowers, and she say, why do you keep, this is now Jean, why do you keep bringing me flowers? And that could be seen as that she is cold, or it could be that, look, this is mostly understood to be some sort of casual relationship. Stop trying to make it more than it is. Yeah. And by Oppenheimer repeatedly doing this, she becomes more attached, which then hurts her in the end. And he is then not there for her when she needed him because he couldn't, because on the bomb and he had to distance himself in some ways. All that to say is we are led to believe she drowns herself in a bathtub after taking pills. But while this scene is being shown to us, which is kind of revealed while Oppenheimer is told about it, there is a flash of someone holding her head down. So the majority of the scene that we're led to believe happened, different edits here and there, is she's drowned herself, but there's a split second of someone drowning her. And I interpret that to be that it's either Oppenheimer thinking at that moment, well, she probably drowned herself because I understood her issues, but perhaps someone killed her. Yeah. And then to your point, Adam, it could be like, well, this acknowledges that at least some people might think there was more foul play or other people were involved, but you just get this very, very quick flash. And it's, again, the skill of the filmmaking for sure. Another gem of a scene is when Robert Oppenheimer is meeting the future Catherine Oppenheimer, and she is currently married to someone else, and they're at some party. Everyone's there, including her husband in the distance, and he says to her, "Aren't you married to Mr. So-and-so?" And she goes, "Not very." Not very married. No, Flavin. So there's just this wonderful, again, the dialogue is wonderful. Another great scene is when Oppenheimer is now talking to, we'll say, some small group of people. There are stadium seats, right? It's sort of a packed house, but it's still relatively small. And they're all stamping, they're cheering his name because the bomb has been developed. It's already been dropped. And he gives some, we'll say, almost stereotypical lines about that see if the Japanese can do about this and that sort of thing. And everyone's cheering and so on. But the way it's cut and edited shows that he's happy about this, but then also very conflicted about the death he might have caused. There's flashes of white light, like the flashes of a bomb going off. And while people are patting him on the back, while he's being cheered on, he steps into a charcoal body. Now, clearly the body's not actually there, but it's a wonderful way of the movie maker, Chris Nolan, conveying the conflicted experience that Oppenheimer is having, where he is plagued by, at least we're led to believe, these concerns about how much suffering he has caused, even at a moment of great triumph and, people giving him all these accolades.
Yeah, and there's, the book gets into this too. Like, obviously, he was very conflicted later in life, and there's a question about how conflicted he really was at the time. Was it a celebratory time? Some people say he was celebrating, but you're not getting into his head, right? It's hard in a movie to show what it's like to get into someone's head about something, and this movie did a really good job of it that you very rarely see in cinema. So, big props to Christopher Nolan for another hit.
Yeah, there you go. Well, it might is this his best movie? Like, it just might be. I'm a fan of Christopher Nolan, even though I like this movie, but I usually had a lot of flaws. Like Interstellar, like the time thing doesn't make sense. Tenet is brilliant in some ways. It doesn't really make sense. Inception, I just love it. Like, how do they really go to sleep and dream? It doesn't make sense.
I really like The Prestige.
Yeah, Prestige is great. Yeah. Didn't make sense. So this is the first, honestly, the most realistic movie. I didn't actually see Dunkirk, so it could be that similar in this domain. And if you look at his oeuvre, like they're all great. Like Memento's good and Insomnia is good and so on. But this might be like one of his best movies for sure. Well, there you go. Well, yeah. What else is he up to, right? Yeah. I mean, it's very impressive that you can do what he can do. Something like Memento, and then Batman stuff, and then all this other stuff, and then a very solid biography. Again, it's mostly people talking about something very important. And yes, the scene about the bomb leading up to the bomb, it's very well done. Suspense is excellently delivered. And I was watching this a bit again, and when they're just putting little pieces together, I realized the music they made, or the sound effects in a way, they made it sound a bit like Geiger counters. So it's not radioactive there in that moment, but it's building, and it does over 10 or 20 minutes, and it's very well done. They also got all the physics right from what I could understand. My first love was physics. Adam said he had these names of these people when he was younger in his mind, and so did I. And so you have people talking about, well, how are we going to get all the uranium packed together, right? Like, well, what if we surround it with normal explosives and implode it? And then what would you do then? And how would you do fission versus fusion? And what are the hydrogen versus other elements? And so that was all very interesting. And then the bomb itself, because light travels faster than sound, the bomb goes off and it is now silent for the audience. Mm-hmm. And then this wave of sound hits while the shockwave, so to speak, hits the participants or the observers many, many, many miles away. And they really conveyed it. Now, in the movie, it's probably a minute long, and in reality, it would have been less time. But I think it was so expertly done. And it's like, well, how do you convey the severity of the first real nuclear explosion of that size? And it was largely visual, but the absence of sound, I think, really added to it. Now, I saw it on my TV at home. Adam saw it in theater. So I'm curious what the experience in the big old IMAX would have been like.
Yeah, I mean, I went out of my way to see it in IMAX, and it wasn't playing everywhere, so I had to see it at a weird time, and I think I drove to Canada too. But yeah, it was really engrossing, right? Like I sat close to the screen, and you're taking it in visually, but the sound in an IMAX theater is also pretty intense. So obviously, a huge explosion and shakes the whole theater, and no, it was cinematically. It's this really engrossing, amazing kind of movie. This kind of feast for your eyes and ears. So I'm glad I did, and I have it on video. I haven't watched it yet at home. I feel like watching it on TV may seem disappointing after that, but
right.
the experience can still be. You can still appreciate it for different things.
It has to become almost a different experience.
Yeah.
I certainly felt that watching at home, like at times the sound was too loud for them to go into the dialogue in the next scene. So it is one of those like, I got to put the volume up and down. I didn't have to do it most of the movie, but at the beginning, I think they were really going for high energy, interesting things. Yeah. And that makes sense. Again, like it's just the movie starting. You have to grab people right away. Sure, that makes a lot of sense. But I thought like, is this one of those things where the filmmaker was like, I don't really care if you understand the dialogue? Because sometimes he'll do that. Like, did you really care if Bane was understood by people when that happened?
Christopher Nolan has a bad reputation for that, right? Like in Dark Knight, there's like this hum throughout almost the whole movie. Yeah. In Tenet, there's always noise. You can't hear what people are saying. People often wearing masks. Bane, like you mentioned. So usually in theaters, it's not as bad because you're isolated in the theater. When it's silent, the whole theater is silent. When it's loud, it's loud. But when you listen to something at home, yeah, it's annoying when you have to bring the volume up and down. They don't sort of flatten the sound like they used to.
Yeah,
back with VHS tapes and stuff like that.
It's also a movie about great moral issues. And as another commentator said, happily, they are shown, a lot of these characters are shown to be tragic figures, not tragic heroes. Yeah. You don't really come away thinking like, oh, Oppenheimer's great and he's just a wonderful person, or anyone else's for that matter, that people had a mission and they were led to believe that dropping the bomb saved American lives instead of invading Japan. And maybe that's to be the case. But separately, the belief that creating such a dangerous weapon would end all wars is, of course, ridiculous in hindsight. Even at the time, it seemed a bit much. But all that to say is that people who did the thing, as Oppenheimer did, felt they weren't responsible in some ways and then realized they kind of were. And it seemed that forever he'd be thinking about his role in this whole scene. And there's this wonderful short scene with Gary Oldman as Truman. And that's just excellent in all sorts of ways where you see the difference of concern or power structures or even understanding of the world. I don't need to spoil that too much, even though I said it, all the other spoilers, but it's just very well done. It's just very well done. And most of the movie's very well done. That's why I want to say like, oh, that scene's good. That scene's good. That other scene is also good.
Yeah. The stakes around it are interesting because after the fact, you can look back and say, well, if they didn't have that bomb, the war probably would have ended, in a matter of time anyway. But we can't really know. But during the events of the movie, it's a race to make the bomb before Germany, and they literally don't know. So if Germany had an atomic bomb before the U.S., it's game over for the world potentially. Right. But. So we know that wasn't the case. And the movie's narrative eventually tells us that wasn't the case. People kind of know when you're watching it anyway. But the characters in the movie don't know that. So for them, it is ultimate stakes.
Yes.
That's it, right?
Yes. Given my book on AI deals with nuclear weapons as an analog for dangers of AI, I couldn't help but think of that through that lens and that kind of concern. Do people think they have to develop it? Do they have to race to develop it? Yep. Also, the concern about just how people feel engaged about the world that they're actually in or not. So my belief is that after watching Oppenheimer, approximately 0 people contacted their political representative and said, hey, what are you doing about nukes? And are you making us safer? Right? It's just not how people think. Even though they just watched a movie about a very the very dangerous weapon that was created, that still exists, that we still have nukes, 9 to 13,000 pointed at each other across the earth, which could cause the deaths of billions of lives. And we've accepted this as normal, even though it's ridiculous. And what are we doing about it? Well, if more people were concerned and engaged, then maybe we would lessen the threat. I'm not saying we go to 0. And yet I could see there's people watching this movie and they'll talk about it like we are, or they'll watch a video and listen to the soundtrack repeatedly. And would they spend 5 minutes sort of actively engaging to reduce the risk? Probably not. So with AI, are people going to do that? I hope so. But the pessimism sets in because of that framing.
Yeah. fear of nuclear war is like, it was a thing in the 80s like, that I kind of grew up with.
Right.
You kind of thought like, oh, the end of the world is just going to happen at some point. And that fear went away. I don't think that risk ever went away.
Yeah, well, right. Well, it decreased.
Yeah.
In theory, like, well, we dropped thousands of thousands. Sorry, we lessened the number of nukes, thousands and thousands. We didn't drop them. But yes, the risk is still there. Once you we can destroy the world 5 times over. Destroying it 10 times over, it's not much of a difference.
No, and yeah. So every once in a while, I think about that, and I have a very simple plan of what I would do if Ottawa got nuked somehow. But yeah, it'd be very terrible. But is it useful to worry about that constantly? Not really.
Well, but that's it. So it's not saying you should worry about it constantly. It shouldn't necessarily keep you up at night. Yeah. Could you spend 10 minutes trying to raise awareness and having some concern? Or, I don't know, you imagine like 1 hour once a year. Yeah. If everyone did that, it really would change things. But I understand how people are. It's just hard to get motivated that way.
Yeah, potential future segment I've thought about doing is like, you could kind of take a half hour to think about how you would react and prepare to a nuclear attack, and it might save your life, right? Like,
correct.
Yes. Okay, here's what you do: you get in your basement, and you get whatever, and
sure,
and that'll help you. Or here's where the radiation will stay or linger, or
right,
worse, or whatever. People don't think about that. People don't want to think about that, but that kind of thing could be like, here's like a maybe low probability, but if it does happen, that low probability thing, here's a high probability chance of changing your life, right?
Well, that could be useful, even like a sort of prepper-based segment where we just say, here's 5 things. Like, by the way, independent of any nuclear attack, you should just have several days, if not weeks, of food and water on hand. Like, that's just good business. Now, maybe not weeks of water, but weeks of some sort of food, if you can find the storage unit. So that just makes a lot of sense to me. Now, the nuke stuff is really hard to, I don't know. Depending how close you are to the blast, like, you're just out of luck. So, could go on and on about just how it's a great movie and some final other thoughts that Oppenheimer was a genius. I think it's often very difficult to depict very, very smart people in movies and television, and I think they did a great job. When I think of other ways that's done, Aaron Sorkin often has very fast dialogue, and it seems sometimes a bit implausible. But Oppenheimer, who had this great faculty with learning multiple languages and understand physics and math, maybe not at the level of the true greats of, Heisenberg or Schrodinger or something like that, but he was very close to being up there and had the practical sense to run a project like this.
Yeah.
It's truly remarkable how capable this person was to do such a thing, and you believe he is capable, even though he's often, he can be arrogant, but he's often quite understated. And that just goes to how A, complex the character is, and B, how great a job Cillian Murphy did. I hear it's a great movie. You should check it out.
Yeah, you just spend 30 minutes listening to us talk about it. Just go watch the movie. Spend 3 hours with it.
Yes. Well, you should watch it, listen to us, then watch it again. We should have a 3-hour podcast with some minute-by-minute commentary.
I'm looking forward to watching it again now.
Yeah, it's great. Okay, well, until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, Q-Boys.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter @TRC_podcast.